Members, when I look at the bill before us today, I think about a man named Jonathan Clarkson Gibbs, who was born in Philadelphia in 1821. He was a minister, an abolitionist, and he was sent to Florida to build churches and schools. When he was in Philadelphia, he was involved with the Underground Railroad. And after emancipation, Jonathan Clarkson Gibbs was appointed here in the state of Florida as the superintendent of education. And one of the things that Jonathan Clarkson Gibbs did was to organize a statewide system of education. And at a state university here in Tallahassee, not far from us, is Gibbs Hall, named for Jonathan Clarkson Gibbs. In St. Petersburg, there is Gibbs High School, named for Jonathan Clarkson Gibbs. There was a Gibbs Junior College in St. Petersburg. It's now St. Pete College. After a very large meal, it's said, in 1874, Jonathan Gibbs became ill and died here in Tallahassee at the age of 53. He had served in this state legislature, and he had also served in Congress. In addition to Jonathan Clarkson Gibbs, I think of Josiah Walls, who was born in 1842 and died in Tallahassee in 1905 at the age of 63. He served 3 years in Congress. And what makes me think of these two people in particular? What makes me think of them is that after emancipation, they were elected to office. They were Republicans, members of the party of Lincoln, the great emancipator. And at that time, it was the Republicans who were pushing for greater inclusion, greater participation in democracy. And these two men were African American. So I think about them because they benefited from Reconstruction. But what happened after African Americans were elected to office, after they participated in the economy, things were put in place to turn the clock back since before Reconstruction. Before Reconstruction, they were considered 3/5 of a human being for purposes of the census, not a whole individual. And then the 15th Amendment was passed in 1869 and ratified in 1870. And in the South, where there had been one master and many, many slaves, there were things put in place to make sure that the economics in the South, the economic system, would not be disrupted. So we had things like poll taxes, where you had to pay to be able to vote, and you had to show the receipt to show that you had paid your poll taxes. You had literacy tests at a time when African Americans were denied the right to learn to read and write. You had literacy tests to determine if you could read or write when it had been unlawful. Now, it had been unlawful because in order to leave the plantation, you had to have a written pass. And if you were literate and you knew how to read and write, you could write your own pass. So it was unlawful to learn to read and write, and yet there were literacy tests put in place. There were grandfather clauses which said that you could only vote if you had voted before 1866, which none of the enslaved people had been able to do. And once emancipation occurred in the South, landowners who freed what had been the machines of a pre-industrial age, put in place sharecropping. And after a whole season of people working in the fields, the sharecropper deducted money for the cost of seed, deducted money for the cost of housing, deducted money for purchases at the store, and said to the sharecropper, we had a good year, you don't owe me anything, and I don't owe you anything. So there was no money to pay poll taxes, let alone to be able to learn to read and write so that you could pass the literacy test. And then property owners were the ones who had the right to vote. So what reminds me of Jonathan Clarkson Gibbs, Josiah Walls, and the things that were put in place that meant that they and people like them could not really participate in democracy is the same thing that we're going through today. After the 1965 Voting Rights Act, we got gerrymandering, where lines were drawn so that there was not full participation. We got harassment, intimidation, economic reprisal. You could lose your job for trying to vote. You just heard about July Perry, who was lynched in 1920 because he wanted to vote in Ocoee, Florida. There was physical violence. People like Harry T. Moore in Mims, Florida, who had a bomb placed under his home in 1951, and he and his wife died. They were organizers for the NAACP, and they were registering African Americans to vote. The physical violence was similar to what you just heard that occurred on the Edmund Pettus Bridge when people were marching between Selma and Montgomery. So if people are now participating, there have to be some other things put in place to curtail their voting rights. So you had ID laws, you had roadblocks at intersections leading to the polling places. You were not going to honor student IDs, even though you would honor a gun permit. You shortened early voting days, no voting on Sunday before elections, no souls to the polls. And now we have a bill that says third-party voter registration groups will be fined $50,000 for not turning in registration cards. So the more things change, the more they stay the same. You had voter purges. You can't vote on college campuses. Felons could not vote until a constitutional amendment was passed here in the state of Florida. And then fines and fees came into being to deal with that. No food and water given to people standing in line waiting to vote, when you would give food and water to an animal left outside or a war criminal known to be an enemy of this country. Signature matches. All of these things are things that are documented in history. It's fact. It's not critical race theory, it's fact. And if we don't learn from what has happened historically, we will repeat it, which is why it is so necessary for us to look at what has happened with regard to voter suppression, and then to look at this bill in the lens of what has happened before. We're talking about felony convictions for people who have 3 ballots in their possession, felony convictions. And so people ask me, how is it that you continue to do this? I intend to stand on the wall because the pendulum does swing. And the moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends toward justice. And you have to view the right for full participation as a marathon and not a sprint. And when you've been involved in a long and challenging race, it's only then that you get your second win. If you sprint to the door, you don't get a second win. And so I've been fighting for voting rights all of my life, and I've had a long and challenging race. I point up this history so that we do not repeat it. And yes, I have been in the race, and I have my second win. Vote down on this very bad voter suppression bill. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.